Welcome, everyone, to episode I Played the Wrong Intro, aka 22 of the chrisperish podcast. Yes, I should learn how to read once in a while. That would go a long way. Decided to do a Saturday stream simply because last week did not work out, and I thought, you know what? Why not do a little bit of double dip for people today? So I brought in Chris Best, the host of Saturday Night Gaming, which you can find out later today on his channel. He'll talk about that when it's time. He's also the co-host of Turnbuckle Studios, and he's also a member of the Raw Patrol and the SmackDown Security Detail Division, whatever you guys are calling it. Whatever you guys want the D to stand for, we don't have to get into that right now. One thing I did want to get into is I was going and doing some errands today, and I thought, you know what? The Bloodline has been around for 3 years already. And then I'm like, you know what? The NWO was around really for 3 years. Hit and miss with some other little things.
Mm-hmm.
Which one is really better if you want to dive into the thing? Because I was listening to an episode of Chris Van Vliet's SCVV episode, and he was saying that kind of resonated with me. That we are looking at a faction that WWE has decided to take its time with, and that is why it's a driving force of its creative in this new era, which made me think, I wonder if this way of thinking would have helped the NWO, because as he said, there were times people were added into the NWO and there wasn't really much meaning behind it. But when somebody like a Tanga Loa or a Tama Tonga have entered the bloodline, there's meaning behind that. So I wanted to kind of bring that as a topic up. And Chris Best, I'll let you kind of dive right into that and get your early thoughts on what I just said.
I kind of like what they're doing with the bloodline. This whole slow build to who's going to join. We were waiting on Tamatonga to come in. We didn't even know that Tonga Loa was going to join. We're waiting on Jacob Fatu for his eventual join, if that's going to even happen. It's a lot better than what they're doing with the NWO. I mean, I remember one time watching Michael Wall Street, Mike Rotundo, one week just doing his Michael Wall Street gimmick, and then the next week just showing up with an NWO shirt. I have no recollection of him even joining or anything like that, just showing up with an NWO shirt on and saying, oh, he's a member of the NWO.
It really was, and I remember hearing this, and that was at one point, if you were a heel and there was no direction for you, or maybe you're a babyface who, let's just say certain people weren't exactly wanting to face, you may or may not have been somebody the NWO went against. So you became a member of the NWO. So if you're a heel and you have nothing going on, stick a black and white shirt on.
Mm-hmm.
If the NWO, and maybe it's, I don't want to specific anybody, but if it's a certain leader of that didn't want to compete against that person, they became a member of the NWO. Because you saw a lot of people join that you kind of wondered why. Like, did Macho Man really have to join the NWO? Or would have been a better way of him actually competing against the NWO?
100% it would have been better if he competed against the NWO, because even his joining, while I liked it at the time, in retrospect, didn't really make much sense. It took away from like all the top guys that could possibly challenge Hogan or Nash or Hall, you know?
And one of the things I kind of wanted to put up. Now, am I against people joining? No. But like I kind of said, like, have it mean something. Like when Sami Zayn joined the Bloodline, there is meaning behind it, and you got a little bit of a flavor behind the bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
There's now a little bit more reasoning, and it kind of hits on a different demographic. Um, Also, just want to give a shout out to Peter Chason, who's watching on Facebook. Thank you. I don't think I've seen you before, but I appreciate that. If you want to be active in the chat and you want to get in on this, let me know. As well as Abhail Gill is watching, as well as our boy Carl Carafel is watching over on the Facebook side. Very much appreciated. But when Sami Zayn joined, there's that different flavor that added to the bloodline. Now, don't get me wrong, there were different flavors in the NWO.
Right.
When you brought in, say, the Giant, that was a different flavor. And it gave you that more of a, okay, yeah, you may have had Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, but they were hitting roughshod on tag teams. But who was really the heater for Hulk Hogan? And then the Giant comes in, and you could step face to one of those guys. But then when the Giant came in, it was difficult. And then only one person was really known to have picked him up before, and that was Goldberg. So there's not a lot of people that pose that real physical threat against the Giant. So, okay, you serve a purpose with the Giant. You have that different flavor. To me, it kind of lost a lot of luster when they're bringing in the Horace Hogans, or they're bringing in the Scott Nortons, the Scott Steiners. Really, a lot of these people just seemed like WCW didn't want to do anything with. Now, what I like about the Bloodline is we're getting a little bit more of an invested background story to it, especially when we all thought, okay, Sami Zayn, he's out of the Bloodline. Him and KO, they take the tag titles away from the Usos. It seemed like that was the eventual first major crack of the Bloodline at WrestleMania 39, only to seem that it would be destined for Cody Rhodes to defeat Roman Reigns for that title, which did not happen at 39. So you were wondering, okay, now how does this continue? Do we lose faith in Cody? Are we now getting tired of the Bloodline? Because it was at a point sometimes a hit or miss with the Bloodline. You kind of wanted to see something different, but then it kept going, and then it became a little bit more all right. When Solo Sikoa joined at Clash at the Castle and he helped Roman Reigns defeat Drew McIntyre, that kind of gave the Bloodline that added flavor that we also didn't know. Also, it was the third Uso. So now we're thinking, okay, what's going to happen here? And then we fast forward all the way to WrestleMania 40. Roman Reigns loses to Cody Rhodes. Disappears off screen for a bit. We've also seen Jey Uso and Jimmy Uso individually break out of the Bloodline. Then Jimmy Uso tried to go back in, eventually is back in, only for Solo Sikoa to kick him out through a debuting Tama Tonga. And then just last week in Lyons, France, at Backlash, we saw Tonga Loa make his debut as Tonga Loa in WWE, but now is that new member of the Bloodline. And we're seeing kind of a new direction with Solo Sikoa taking that primal lead as the modern day tribal chief now. He is the second coming of Roman Reigns, which at one point was self-appointed by Roman Reigns that Solo would be the next in line to be tribal chief. So now when we think that there's going to be that switch, because I make comparisons that after WrestleMania 14, when Shawn Michaels lost to Stone Cold Steve Austin, the next night we're seeing Triple H kind of revamp Degeneration X by bringing in X-Pac, the New Age Outlaws, and now all of a sudden they're babyface, more or less. Now we're seeing a new flavor of Degeneration X. Now we're seeing that new flavor of the Bloodline, which now, after 3 years, they found a way to completely revitalize the group with completely different members than the beginning part.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're even seeing a different side of the family, because instead of it all being Samoans, we're seeing it primarily based on Tongans. So when we go back to that family tree that The Rock puts up at the WrestleMania press conference, showing you that, and really that blood agreement between the Tongans and the Samoans, now it seems like we're seeing an individual at home new version of the bloodline that could compete with the original, because we haven't seen Jimmy Uso since he was taken out by Solo and Tama Tonga. We don't know what Jey Uso thinks. That has never been met yet. And we also don't know what Roman Reigns thinks. So we have 3 original members of the bloodline unsure how they feel about the modern day version of the bloodline, and thus creating a completely new dynamic to this story. Now, we've seen a comparison with that with the NWO when they tried to do the Wolfpack, when they did the NWO 2000, but it never really hit. So if the WWE today were able to go back and fix that, the NWO, I think I would say NWO is a better faction. Now, I think they're a completely better group in terms of what they did for the business, because the Monday Night Wars was really only started based on the creation of the NWO, but it also helped kill the Monday Night Wars as well. We haven't seen that with the Bloodline. So where do you go from the destruction of the NWO to now the revitalization of the Bloodline?
That's a tough question. Holy Christ. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I was skeptical about the new version of the Bloodline, but as the weeks are rolling on, I'm starting to like become invested again in what they're doing with the Bloodline. But as far as like the NWO, geez. Yeah, they were one of the catalysts for the destruction of the Monday Night Wars. The NWO kind of fell apart for me at the finger poke of doom when they decided to reunite the Wolfpack and the NWO Black and White. Kind of fell apart for me there. I'm very curious though about like what Roman, Jay, and Jimmy are going to do. And hell, let's even say, what if they get Sami Zayn back involved too? I'm kind of interested to see how that all pans out.
Yeah. And that's always going to be, I think, something of, okay, like how do we go from here? Because one name that we haven't really talked about yet for the modern day bloodline that's been rumored and rumored and rumored has been Jacob Fatu.
Mm-hmm.
So if by chance he is going to come into this version of the bloodline, that now makes 4 members of the modern day bloodline. So if you're going to combat them, what are the 4 members of, if it is the other bloodline? We know it's Roman. We can only presume it's both Jimmy and Jey Uso.
Mm-hmm.
Is the next one Sammy, or could it even be Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson? Because in my theory, and I want to hear what you think about this, I think this is what the 4 you go with at War Games for this year's Survivor Series. But the way that the modern day bloodline, the Team Solo bloodline, wins is by The Rock costing Roman Reigns. And thus is how you now create Roman versus Rock in Vegas for WrestleMania 41. And then, maybe just then, we see somebody else come into play with the bloodline to help even it out. But we just don't know. That could be is when a Sami Zayn comes in. We can
Mhm.
almost see some, I don't know, like I'm just spitballing stuff here, but I do think at some point, and I do think the next WrestleMania we will see The Rock versus Roman Reigns. I think that match will happen. But how we get there, who knows? But my thought is, how do you combat this version of the bloodline? Because if Roman Reigns comes back and he aligns with it, well, who's really the people that are going to go against it?
That's the big question. That is. And you said something interesting with The Rock possibly turning on Roman Reigns in War Games, and it reminded me again back to the NWO. It was the NWO versus the Four Horsemen inside War Games. One of the horsemen got injured, and I can't remember which one it was, and they got Kurt Hennig to join.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt Hennig then turned on the horsemen, joining with the NWO during said match. That didn't lead to anything big. I think it only led to Kurt Hennig fighting Ric Flair at like Starrcade or something like that.
We got the Bulkster coming in and saying the Pride could. I think the Pride versus the Bloodline could be a good temporary thing. But do you really want to see the Pride? Is Bobby Lashley the superstar that you think can help end the Bloodline? That's going to be the question.
It would be a good starter feud for the current incarnation of the Bloodline.
My problem with Bobby Lashley, and this is unfortunate, but this is something that's also a reality. The Pride is getting little to zero reaction when they're coming out. And to me, I think this is something to do. I don't think it falls squarely on Bobby Lashley, but I do think it is partially on Bobby Lashley to find that way to make it more of a thing, because you have the Street Profits, who everybody enjoys watching. Montez Ford has charisma that bleeds. But the one thing that I'm very uncertain about is how a Solo Sikoa versus Bobby Lashley feud will go. And then I will also counter with who counters BFAB from the street or from the Bloodline. It's not going to be Paul Heyman. No. Is this the perfect time you bring in Nia Jax as that first female to the Bloodline? I think now that she's on SmackDown, I think the time is to go that route. Another one I could easily see is a Tamina. And that way I can see Naomi being on the counter end side.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jimmy Uso, when he comes back, will be a babyface once again. He happens to be married to Naomi. I think that fits, especially if you have Solo and Nia versus maybe Jimmy and Naomi. I think that's already 10 times more investing of my emotional stature as a fan. And Bulkster, to your point, I like Street Profits. I think they're fantastic.
Yeah.
And they do have great
and they did have
chemistry.
Yeah.
But my problem is, can they sustain that emotional feud with the Bloodline?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question there. I mean, they had great chemistry in their match with Tama Tonga yesterday. But long-term wise, that's where the problems lay. Is this feud worthwhile in the long-term investment?
Yeah, and that's what I was always just kind of on the assumption of, okay, like, do we see this version of the Bloodline run through the SmackDown roster until we then get Roman Reigns coming back? And I think one of the main reasons why Roman Reigns withdrew from the draft was so he could be on the similar level of Rock, as Raw can free flow from either Raw or SmackDown because he is not a branded member.
Right.
So if Raw or SmackDown needed that big time feud to help push you into a big PLE like a WrestleMania, even a Royal Rumble, SummerSlam, Survivor Series as examples, that's the show that you can bring those two on, especially SmackDown, as it has all members of the current day bloodline. But another reason I wanted to kind of go with the bloodline versus NWO at this point was I don't think it's not comparable to talk about the impact to what NWO meant for the business. And it's one of those things where WWE still sells NWO merchandise. The NWO shirt is very popular and one of the fastest selling t-shirts of all time. So it brought in a lot of money.
Still to this day, there are two types of shirts I see every Monday night, every Friday night. Stone Cold Steve Austin and NWO shirts in the crowd.
Yeah. And we could easily say, because it's without a shadow of doubt, that the NWO was to the Monday Night Wars as what the bloodline is to this modern era. I think from an impactful standpoint, they're both very good there. I think the major problem when you look at, okay, why did WCW fail? It's because they don't have the Cody Rhodes. They don't have the other stories. And the NWO never made multiple superstars from past feuds. When you look at it, usually the people they feuded later joined the faction. The only guy of relevance that you knew who fought against the NWO and succeeded or did anything like that was Sting. You don't remember the Four Horsemen against the NWO. That was never something that made people care long term. It could have, but it was just never a thing. And the major one that you saw was Sting being the guy that took down Hulk Hogan, a la Cody Rhodes taking down Roman Reigns. But when Hulk Hogan first lost that world championship, the NWO never saw the light of its prime since. Whereas we are now looking at a potential new prime of its existence in the bloodline after Roman lost his title.
Yeah.
And to me, that is a very intriguing concept. And it's why I wanted to beg the question, who really is a better faction? The New World Order or the Bloodline? Because at this point in junction, I think the Bloodline has full-on entered that status and belongs in the conversation of best faction of all time.
100%, because both NWO and the Bloodline were both started from times when pro wrestling was at its lowest. You had the Bloodline starting up during the pandemic and slowly just turning that view on the WWE around, because let's face it, the pandemic era of WWE sucked.
Yeah, there were some good things that we could take away from the pandemic, but at the same time, the one thing that we cannot get past is the fact that, hey, no fans. You don't get that Lyons France energy from the crowd during the pandemic era because there wasn't any. So I mean, it's hard when you watch live sports. You want to see a live aura of that, whether it's a hockey game, a football game, a wrestling event, soccer match, anything like that. That aura of the fans help make the show better or the performance better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we missed during the pandemic. pandemic era. But
right, and then when the NWO started, though, wrestling all across the board was just horrible as well. I mean, attendance figures were down for both WCW and WWE. And it really was the NWO saying, hey, look, or Eric Bischoff saying, hey, look, we need to do something different. Let's turn Hogan heel. Let's bring in Hall and Nash. Let's get this thing going.
yeah, and that's something that we have already in WWE. We had, I mean, let's not get it wrong. Vince McMahon had a vision and allowed it to breathe initially with the bloodline. It just became a completely different beast when that creative switch happened and we saw Nick Khan, Triple H, and those guys take the reins of Roman's direction and vision within the bloodline. And that's something that, you know, to their credit, now we're used to seeing that more patient approach. Let everything matter. Have something small lead into something big. Let's watch the seeds grow before we decide whether or not we're planting or not. Whereas in WCW, it felt that a lot of that time was, okay, you just wanted to cut the root out and hope that you got it again.
Yeah.
There was a quick fix. There's a quick fix because instead of the NWO WCW story becoming the real focal point, or that we all knew that died because, let's face it, that match between Hulk Hogan and Sting with Bret Hart as that referee, the single fact that you never had a clear-cut win for Sting, I think ruined that whole stuff. And what that's like, where you could have gone forward or just moving on from that point.
Yeah.
I think the fact that there was a little bit of just that politic backstage stuff and you didn't have that clean drop to where now Sting looks like he is the guy. Now you could have came back with the NWO using its numbers, using its power to bring that back, but instead, that's not what we got. We ended up getting dissension in the NWO. That's allowing the Wolfpack to become a thing. And now the Wolfpack was cool because everybody who wasn't NWO wanted to be Wolfpack. Thus, It was sporting the same logo, just in a different color. And I think the problem is they weren't sporting the WCW. And I think that's why the fans maybe didn't care about it, because the traditionalists who were WCW fans weren't given an option after that point anymore.
Yeah, and the one thing about the Wolfpack that didn't make a lick of sense to me was when Sting joined.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make any sense to me, especially after the big feud with Hogan. And I understand like he joined because they had a common enemy in Hogan, but he didn't necessarily have to join, and just he could have formed an alliance with them and be like, hey, look, Kevin, hey, look, Nash, Hogan and his boys are giving me problems. Let's pair up and do something about this. And then we'll go our separate ways.
And we go back to that earlier conversation. Why are you joining? And does it matter?
Yeah.
Because if you joining that faction has no meaning behind it, it falls flat. We could say that, like, I'll go back and I'll give you another like example. I'll go to the Judgment Day. The Judgment Day have never brought in somebody that didn't have a meaning behind it, or at least a story.
Right.
You started with Edge, who then turned heel and eventually brought in Damian Priest, who helped him win.
Yeah.
He found his protege. Right? Then later, Rhea Ripley joins. And now it's a trio. And then Edge has a match with Finn Balor, and you do Brute Edge versus the Demon Balor. And Edge basically said on his when he was on Chris Van Vliet's episode that the reason why the switch happened was because of the scarcity of baby faces at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Cody got hurt. I think our AJ just turned, so he wasn't really back up to where he needed to be. And they didn't have. I'm forgetting somebody else, but I know somebody else was hurt at the same time. I think Randy was also hurt, so there's just nobody there on the babyface end. So they had the switch and basically had Finn Balor take his place. But then, okay, you had a reason why Finn came in, was to take over for Edge.
Right.
You knew why Damian came in. He was Edge's protege. He is the OG member of the Judgment Day. And then you had Rhea, who becomes the female muscle of the group.
Right.
And then you go all the way down to where Edge is fighting against the Judgment Day. And he picks Dominic and Rey Mysterio to be his tag partners. And then little behold, we had some issues with Rey and Dom. And the Judgment Day scoops up Dominic Mysterio. And the reason for that is to help Judgment Day's rise to not only dominate their brand, but also now to kind of defeat Rey Mysterio. You have to think, too, on a little different side. Now Dominic has found a real family. So at that point, now Dominic believes that the Judgment Day are this group that is larger than just a group.
Yeah.
He finds the Judgment Day, he finds Mommy, and then now he has spread into one of the best heels in pro wrestling, to the point where fans are on that brink of wanting to cheer for him because he is that good of a heel. And then you have JD, who everybody knows is a protege of Finn Balor. And there was a story there. It was month after month after month of JD having an initiation to join.
Yeah.
So when he finally did, it's because he won over everyone. And the big story was he had to win over Damian Priest, the OG member.
Yeah.
So there is meaning behind those inclusions. And that allows Judgment Day to have gone on now for what? Almost 2.5 years.
Pretty close to it.
And they've had their ups and downs on being a relevant group, but at the same time, they're staying together. You don't mix away from what they're doing.
Right.
And you see that with the Triple H era, that, okay, I know that it's not the number one act right now. But instead of just kind of taking it apart and going away, there's a patient approach. There's a slow play. We'll find out who is hot in that group. And in their luck, Rhea Ripley was that person.
Right.
And then she helped bring that group back up to a level that allowed you to look at all members a little bit better of. And then now you see Damian Priest as your world heavyweight champion. You see Dominic Mysterio as that guy who should be a mid-level champion. He has that believability. You now want to see whether or not Finn Balor is going to do something or not against Damian Priest, because he does not want to go after the tag titles that they lost at WrestleMania. So there's now story among story among story, whereas Dom is trying to help the group by bringing in people. So there's all these now stories that make that group much more interesting and intriguing, just like the
Mhm.
Bloodline had throughout its history, especially when they had Sami Zayn, who helped kind of wrap everything back around. Now you made Kevin Owens a real person of interest to go after, and we saw Kevin Owens kind of be that guy that pushed the Bloodline away after Cody won the title. Said, "Nope, this isn't your locker anymore. It's Cody's." So he was Solo's first guy of attack. So it all comes back around because Solo and KO are reminiscences of KO and Roman. And then now
Yeah.
we're seeing Randy kind of be brought in that mix. And eventually it will be Cody Rhodes once again. I am sure of that. But yeah, there's a lot of continuation and there's a lot of meaningful inclusions and a lot of meaningful to why they're in the pathway of that group. Whereas, again, there was too much scatteredness with the NWO throughout time.
Yeah, because with the NWO, you'd have Hogan. I'm gonna go feud with Sting. Hall and Nash. Okay, we're gonna go feud with the Steiner brothers. Macho Man. I'm gonna go feud with DDP, and there was just no cohesiveness there. Like we're getting even with the Judgment Day. Yeah, the Judgment Day has all their individual feuds, but they get together and be like Damien would be like, okay, I need help with Jey Uso. He's causing me troubles, and Finn would come out and attack Jey Uso.
Yeah.
We didn't get that much with the NWO, really. I mean, we did
And
for the main event scenes, but not for again, Hall and Nash with the Steiner brothers or whatever.
yeah, and that's something that I strongly believe if the NWO had a lot more meaningful stories within all members instead of just Hulk Hogan,
Mm-hmm.
if they cared about the tag titles as much as they cared about the world heavyweight titles, or at least peered that way because they were in the possession of the NWO.
Mm-hmm.
Like, imagine if the spray paint actually went on the tag titles when the Outsiders held them.
Yeah.
A lot more unity within the WCW, within the fans wanting to see people go after them. And I do think that's when you could have seen the Steiner brothers remain the Steiner brothers and not have to join the NWO because they could have been that dominant tag team that fights up against the Outsiders. And I think just the simple nearsighted look of, okay, we just need to make Scott Steiner a bad guy now. I think he could have saved that by making the Steiner brothers one of your most prolific tag teams of all time, even more so than what they already were.
And the same could have been done with Harlem Heat, for instance. I mean, Harlem Heat at the time was on the rise. Harlem Heat already had 7 tag team titles, I think, to their name at that point.
And that's just it. I really do believe that the NWO and the creative that were behind it now, in theory, amazing idea, revolutionary faction, and probably one of the best impactful factions ever in pro wrestling. But it had a lot of faults behind it as well. And I think that's something that when they were crumbling down, boy, was it quick. And boy, was it noticeable. And it's almost like the foundation wasn't strong enough to hold anything. It was just as soon as one chain link cracked, the whole thing went down. Whereas right now, we're seeing something very similar within the Bloodline. Their main act loses their title after the tag titles were lost. That was a big thing, but it was kept together with that world title. It's very similar to the NWO. But now we're seeing the Bloodline remain something of relevancy, and you're not adding all these new guys for the sake of making it fresh. What you're seeing is specific people that are within the family, and you're keeping that integrity alive. And that is family. And I think that is something very key to point out and very key to understand, that really you have this long list, but now all of a sudden, Tama Tonga has one match on SmackDown. It's in the King of the Ring qualifying match, and you cared. As soon as his music hit, you cared. And I believe the same will go for Tangaloa too. And I think right away, they are elevated on just within their induction into this group, with the sense of when they do come into the fold, they're making an impact while doing so, and they're doing something of meaning. Whereas Tama Tonga helped Solo beat up Kevin Owens, Dallas's inclusion, and then you had Tangaloa help Solo and Tama Tonga defeat KO and Randy Orton at Backlash. So there's levels of why their inclusion mattered.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't really,
and that's the
and
beauty
we
of
also,
what they're.
go ahead.
I was gonna say, and that's the beauty of the bloodline right now, is they're building the bloodline, but on the opposite side, they're building that other equation, that other group of wrestlers that can challenge the bloodline. And that was the problem with the NWO as well. They took the NWO, they took all these top guys, but they forgot the other side of the equation. Yes, they had Goldberg, they had DDP, but they needed more. They needed more depth on that side to feud with the NWO, and they didn't really have that.
Yeah, and one of the things with DDP, he was one of the big names that flat out rejected the NWO.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a meaning. But what they did with him following, there was nothing. Did he win a title?
Other than that victory,
yeah, like did he win a
he
major
beat the
title?
Macho Man. That's about it.
Yeah, but he never became world champion. They never led to making him bigger. And I think that's something that really, at the very least, Cody Rhodes loses only to be bigger and better. You had Kevin Owens lose multiple times against Roman, but becomes a champion later on and main events of WrestleMania and beats the Usos. So he does take a bite out of the bloodline at some point in the latter part after his initial contact with the bloodline. Sami Zayn, same thing. You look at all these guys that are still in the company who had major threats with the bloodline, they almost have done something of stature that helped take a bite out of the bloodline or try to. Whereas, and I was going to say right before you talked about that, is that also the departures of the bloodline have been of meaning as well. Yep. Whereas the departures of people in the NWO, it was almost like, hey, 1 week you're in NWO, 1 week you're not. And it's very confusing. And it's, I think now the one thing the bloodline, I think, needs that could really settle the score of, if just to make it completely undeniable if they are better than the NWO, is if in 10, 15 years, we're talking about the bloodline versus a modern day thing, and we're seeing elements in the business inspired by the bloodline. And I say that because we're seeing the Latino World Order in WWE at modern day, and there would be no LWO if it wasn't for the NWO. So at some point, we do have to give credit to the NWO and what it's done to the modern day product. But at the same time, it's something that when you dive into the specifics of what they did and what they were able to do just within the confines of their company and storyline purpose, I don't know if they're better than the bloodline.
Yeah, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I kind of agree with you, because I can't tell you how many times Giant has joined the NWO and was kicked out of the NWO, but it got to a point where I stopped caring about him because I think it was about 3, maybe 4 times where he joined the NWO only to get kicked out again. And after the last kick out and when he left and went to WWF, I kind of didn't care that he got kicked out. I wanted to see him go to WWF because I was just sick and tired of the way they were treating him in WCW.
Yeah. And he goes to WWE and he almost flips from babyface to heel as many times as he flipped from NWO or not.
Yeah.
So consistency, perhaps. But yeah, no, I think I think it is one of those. It's a fun topic because I think what the bloodline is in the confines of what they do. I think, like I said, from a creative standpoint, from what they're doing, I think they are a better faction to watch on an everyday week than what I thought the NWO was over time. But I will never say the Bloodline is a better faction on the impact to the business because what we saw from the NWO, and we're not even talking about the guaranteed contracts that came that helped change the landscape of how free agents came to be and things like that. But just from a social aspect of, we still see NWO shirts. We're seeing an LWO still to modern day product that helped inspire a Bullet Club, which we still see to this day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is an impact. And I think if the Bloodline can, in time, have that same impact, I don't think there's a question of whether or not they're better. I think it's one of those, who's a better faction? It's Bloodline 1 and NWO 2, potentially lower. And I think that's that. But I think at the same time, it's a fun conversation because really of prime time as a faction, they're pretty close already. And I thought that was pretty wild to think that the Bloodline have been around as long as the prime version of the NWO, black and white.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about the overall impact of the NWO, and I'm thinking about how there's fans who wear the shirts, there's wrestlers who still wear their shirts, but the NWO has actually generated into the non-wrestling fans who wear the NWO shirts and not even know who the NWO is. I remember some years ago, one of the Kardashians, I can't even remember which one, wore an NWO shirt to a fashion show.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, like, it's one of those things where that's why I'm curious in 10, 15 years from now, do we see people grow up on the Bloodline and they're sporting Bloodline merch down the road? And that's what's always very interesting because it's hard to talk about the impact of a modern day act because all we know is what they've done modern day. We don't know what they're capable of doing down the road because, well, we're not living down the road. We're living where we are right now. But yeah, no, that was exactly what was on my mind. That's exactly what I want to talk about. Who would have thought we were able to talk almost an hour about NWO versus the Bloodline? But I wanted to give you a chance to talk about Saturday Night Gaming that we have, or that you have coming up tonight. And what other things do you have on the docket, Chris Best?
All right, so obviously you can find Saturday Night Gaming at my YouTube channel at CBRS Entertainment. You can look for it also on Twitch TV, CBRS_entertainment. If you want to follow me for all my other socials, you can find me threads.net at cbestfilms83, facebook.com chris.best83, tiktok.com at cbrs.entertainment. Tonight, Saturday Night Gaming will be the start of Uncharted 4. That's the 4th game out of 5 games in the series, so we're nearing the end already here on this series. Look for me Monday nights 8 p.m. alongside Chris Perish, alongside Carl Carafel, Bubba Duke, OMD. I almost forgot OMD's name for some reason, and myself, as we do the Raw Patrol over on youtube.com at turnbuckle_studios. Look for me there as well. Tuesday night, 8:05 Eastern, as we do Turnbuckle Talk, where we're going to talk about a plethora of wrestling news. There's already a few stories that are cooking that I'm looking into right now.
Good stuff. And obviously, you will be able to find my socials in the outro video. So I please advise you guys to please like, please subscribe, please follow all those channels. It helps really give me that great support for the channel. And if you want to do more in terms of supporting, please go to rogueenergy.com and use my promo code PERISH, PERISH. Not only it saves you 10%, but a little bit of that also kicks back over. Please like and follow me on Spotify, as you'll see the Chris Perish podcast on Spotify right now. So yeah, make sure you're checking all that. And you can also go back and check out all episodes of the Chris Perish podcast. Where you can find me is tomorrow. I'm right back here with episode 23. That's Chris Perish podcast, as scheduled at 12:15 p.m. Eastern time, live on Facebook, live on Twitch, live on YouTube. But for then, I'll see you then. But for now, I will bid you adieu. I will also say, go Saints.